When salt is dissolved in water, the eye sees only a single clear presence. Yet within it, two identities remain, one that flows, and one that rests in stillness. To separate them is not to force nature, but to guide it back to balance, using simple principles that govern all things. Take a small pot and pour the salt water into it. Place it over gentle heat. As the warmth rises, the water begins to change its state. It does not resist, it simply transforms into vapor and ascends into the air, leaving behind what it once carried. The salt, unable to rise with the vapor, remains at the base, slowly becoming visible again as crystals form. If one desires to collect the water again, a simple lid placed above the pot can serve as a cooling surface. The vapor touches the cooler surface and returns to liquid form, dripping into a separate container. In this way, water is gathered once more, pure and separated, while salt remains behind. This method teaches more than a physical process. It reveals that separation is not destruction, but understanding the natural differences in behavior. Water chooses to rise when warmed. Salt chooses to stay when the water departs. Each follows its own nature, without conflict. In daily life, many things appear: mixed thoughts, emotions, and situations that seem impossible to untangle. Yet with patience, observation, and the right conditions, clarity emerges just as salt and water find their distinct paths. Again, one does not need force, only awareness of transformation. Heat becomes the guide, condensation becomes the return, and stillness becomes the witness. Thus, even in a simple act of separating salt from water, there is a lesson. When elements are allowed to follow their true nature, harmony is restored without struggle. Salt dissolves in water and appears as one substance, but both retain their separate identities. Within the mixture, when salt is placed into water, it seems at first that it disappears completely, leaving no trace of its former form. The water becomes clear and uniform, and the eye can no longer distinguish between what was salt and what was water. Yet, this is only an appearance. In truth, the salt does not cease to exist. It only changes its state of presence. Its tiny particles spread evenly throughout the water, becoming invisible but not destroyed. Each grain of salt carries its own nature, and even when it is dissolved, that nature remains intact within the mixture. The water also retains its own identity, holding and carrying the salt without losing its essence. This teaches that separation is not always about visible boundaries, but about understanding deeper reality. What seems lost is often only transformed into a subtler form. In daily observation, many things are like this. Thoughts, emotions, and experiences may seem to merge or disappear, yet they continue to exist in quieter forms within us. Just as salt can return to its visible crystalline shape when water is removed, so too can hidden truths become visible again when conditions change. Thus, dissolution is not an ending, but a state of union where individuality still quietly persists within the whole. waiting for the right moment to reappear clearly once more. Heating the salt water causes the water to evaporate into vapor, while the salt remains behind as solid crystals. To separate salt from water, one must first understand the gentle change that heat brings into nature. When salt water is placed over a source of warmth, it slowly rises into the air as vapor, leaving behind the salt that once rested quietly within it. This process is not sudden. It unfolds with patience, as if nature itself is teaching the value of gradual transformation. The salt, being heavier and unable to turn into vapor under normal conditions. Over time, as more water leaves, the salt becomes more visible and eventually forms crystals. Again, this simple act reveals how two different elements respond differently to the same condition. Water moves upward and disappears into the air, while salt stays grounded and returns to its solid form. In this separation, there is no conflict, only natural behavior, unfolding as it should, if one wishes to preserve the water as well. A cooling surface can be placed above, allowing the rising vapor to condense back into droplets and be collected separately. In this way, both elements are gently guided back into their original forms, showing that even mixtures can be undone through understanding, patience, and respect for natural change. Using a lid or cool surface allows the evaporated water to condense back into liquid form, enabling collection of pure water. If one observes the separation of salt from water closely, it becomes clear that transformation is the key principle behind the process. When heat is applied to salt water, it does not break the mixture violently. Instead, it encourages change in a natural and orderly way. The water, being light and responsive to heat, begins to rise as invisible vapor. This rising is not random, but a steady movement driven by energy. As the water departs, it gradually reduces the liquid in the container, making the salt more concentrated. The salt itself does not travel with the vapor because its nature does not allow it to change into gas under ordinary conditions. Instead, it remains grounded, slowly reforming into solid grains. As the surrounding water disappears, this contrast between rising and staying creates a visible separation without force or disruption. If the process is continued with care, one can also collect the evaporated water by guiding it toward a cooler surface, where it turns back into liquid drops. In this way, both components are respectfully restored. This method shows that separation is not about destruction, but about understanding how different substances respond to energy. Everything follows its own path. And when those paths are understood, even mixtures that seem permanent can be gently divided through awareness and patience. The process shows that separation is achieved not by force, but by understanding the natural properties of each element. To separate salt from water is to observe how nature responds when conditions are gently changed. When heat is introduced to the mixture, it does not disturb the salt directly. Instead, it first influences the water, which is more sensitive to temperature change. the water begins to transform into vapor, rising upward and leaving the container in an invisible form. This movement is steady and continuous, as if the water is returning to the air from which it once came. As the liquid diminishes, the salt that was once hidden within the solution becomes more and more visible. It slowly gathers at the bottom and begins to form solid crystals again. This reveals an important truth. Even when substances appear fully merged, their individual properties remain unchanged beneath the surface. The salt does not vanish, nor does it lose its nature. It simply waits while the water departs. If one wishes to capture both elements, a simple cooling surface placed above the rising vapor can help turn it back into droplets, allowing the water to be collected separately. In this quiet process, nothing is forced or broken. Everything follows its own nature, showing that separation is achieved through understanding transformation rather than resisting it, and through patience rather than control. The method teaches a deeper lesson of patience and awareness, showing that clarity and balance emerge when things follow their true nature. In the final step of separating salt from water, one comes to understand that completion is not achieved through force. When the salt water is gently heated, the water begins its journey of transformation, rising upward as vapor, leaving behind what it can no longer carry. This gradual departure continues until the liquid portion becomes less and less, and the container holds mostly salt in its resting form. The salt, once hidden in clarity, now becomes fully visible again, often forming small crystals that gather at the bottom or along the sides. This return to solid form shows that it was never truly lost, only